Last but not least is rendering. Now we've rendered throughout the course, but there's a few parameters I want to show you that we can help that can help you set things up a little bit nicer. So from the shader tree, select the render right there. Okay, and when you do that, the properties appear for all of your render commands. So there's not necessarily a render window like there is in other programs. It's all within the properties. Now initially, we've been using one camera throughout the scene, throughout all of our scenes in the course. But you can have multiple cameras. You can have one camera that's close up, one camera that's maybe riding along in a car for a car accident, one camera that's stationary. Well, you can only render from one camera at a time, and that is where you would select it here. So if you had a secondary camera, you would choose that. Your first frame and your last frame, okay, and that typically corresponds with your timeline. It can be different. They're not going to automatically update. So if you set a longer length here, make sure that it's corresponding here so you don't cut yourself short. Frame step is set to 1, meaning every frame, 1, 2, 3, will render. You could set it to perhaps 2, and every other frame, 1, 3, or I could set this to 2, and that means now every frame step would render from 2 to 4 to 6, and so on. Frame passes, we could do anywhere from 1, 4, or 5, whatever we want to do. The output pattern, we're going to leave those as they are, but you can change, a few variations here from stereo side, render pass output, stereo side, frame, if we're going to do any kind of stereoscopic rendering. The frame, we're going to render in pixels, but for those of you doing magazine type stuff and print work, you can set this to inches and very easily say, well, I need 8.5 by 11 at 300 dpi, and there you go. Just press render and you're good to go for that size. So, very nice. The rest of us will render in pixels. Well, that will actually translate it. So if you're ever wondering what 8.5 by 11 at 300 dpi is, well, it's 2550 by 3300. So it does the math for us. You can set 1920 by 1080 for HD. And then if you click the gang select 3 times and then bring this down, it will bring those values so you can instantly jump to 720p, which is 1280. Like that. Undo, and actually that's not correct. Let's do it twice. Let's see if that works. Yeah, my values are not corresponding. Yeah, that's it. Bring it down, just click that gang select twice, and 1280, there you go, 1280 by 720. Okay. DPI, of course, dots per inch, and your pixel aspect ratio. Typically, you're not going to change this. Back in the olden days when we used to go to videotape, we would set it to 0.9 for rectangular pixels. But if you're staying within the computer, it's always 1.0, unless you have some very specific reason why you would change that. Your buckets, when you press F9, not F8, F9, and you get all these fun little squares, those are your buckets. Okay, and you can change those. I've never had much of a need to change them. I've tried, and I think these default values work well. The bucket order you can change, and so on. Then you can have a render region. And with a render window that comes up, like this. Now I'll just abort this real quick. Yes, you can actually draw out a render region in here. And just set that up so that if you want to render out just a really large scene, for instance, and you only want to see a certain portion of it, you could render out that region. So it works out pretty nicely. I've had to do it quite a few times for various things. Then when you go to settings, some of the more important areas here. And let me go back here. There's one other thing, and it'll get you, because it's gotten me. Down here where the little envelope is, not the graph header, hit the options. See right here, the frame rate, it defaults to 24 frames a second. Okay, so a couple of years ago, I was actually rendering an animation, all these huge animations, 24 frames a second in single frames. I would import those frames into QuickTime Pro and export them out for broadcast at 2997, which is just a little more accurate than 30 frames a second, but essentially it's the same. Well, they played okay, but there was a slight little jitter. Just really, really, really slight. Well, that's why. I was rendering at 24 frames a second, but I was importing and resaving my QuickTimes at 2997. So that little bit of frame difference was showing up. So just something to be aware of, that if you are going to broadcast or you're dumping into another edit, just be careful of that, because it's not in the camera panel here. It's kind of buried down in the very bottom of the screen. So again, press Options and make sure you keep an eye on that frame rate. All right, so now back to settings. The anti-aliasing, very important. Defaults at 8. I've seen people go as high as this. It'll take forever to render. Generally, I stick in the middle somewhere, depending on the scene. And the anti-aliasing is like a blurring, so it goes around all the edges of your models and cleans them up. Okay, so it's trial and error, depending on what your scene is, but for the most part, you're going to want somewhere right in here for a nice clean render. And then the Gaussian is a type of blurring, but you can try the Catmull, you can try triangle and box, but I've always found that that works best. The environment shading rate. All right, now if you click over here, there's a little drop-down arrow. If you click that, it basically tells you that a higher value is more coarse and a lower value is more fine. What does that mean? Well, if you're doing global illumination, you've got some area lights on, bring this value down so you have a finer sampling and you'll get cleaner renders. Something like this scene that we're doing, you don't need to change that too much. The refinement shading rate, same kind of idea. Lower is better. No refinement, well, you're going to have some kind of blotchy renders if you're using area lights and some other things. Now for this scene, I want to put depth of field on. Okay. Now for those of you that are not new depth of field, basically it's a way that you can create some nice bokeh. I know some people say bokeh, but I say bokeh. It's also like niche or niche. Which is it? Tomato, tomato. And with the depth of field on, I need to set my camera properly. So I'm going to select the camera, and I need to increase my focal length. So just the way it is in the real world, if I have a long zoom lens, meaning I'm increasing my focal length, and then I back that camera out, I'll be able to create a more shallow depth of field, meaning the things that are in focus are more shallow or more narrow, for narrow depth of field. And you can see right there all that blur. Okay, but my camera is way out here now, and I'm zooming in. So what I need to do then is change my f-stop. So let's go back up to camera effects. And for the depth of field setting here, here's the focal distance, and here's the f-stop at f4. Now, these things never really work exactly right. I actually did a photo shoot today at f8 and was about this distance and actually had quite a good bit of focus. So this is going to be trial and error to get this where you want it. And if it's too much, let's go back to camera view. I'll pull my focal length back down, maybe about to 80 millimeters, and then I'll push in. So I think all the Luxology programmers are great, but I don't know if these camera values equal anything like what I have in my studio. And that's okay. Don't try and make them equivalent. Just set things until they look right. Okay, so now I'll bring my f-stops back down. And it's a little bit harder on something like this too, simply because these things are already soft and blurry. But you can see down here, see the blur going on right here? Okay. Well, what's going to help me focus a little bit better, if I press the Y command, I get a little handle right here. And I can drag that to where I want my focus. So I can focus right in on the center, or even just all the way through towards my blobs. And that means my blobs will be more in focus, but all these little things here will be out of focus. And then I can bring the f-stop back down. And let's bring it way down so we can see what's happening. See that? See all that blur right there coming in? Okay, but this is in focus. Okay, so the depth of field is working. It's just a matter of setting those parameters. You can put motion blur on if something's moving. I highly recommend that. It looks awesome. Great realism. And stereoscopic rendering. It'll separate the renders for both eyes. And a clipping plane if you want to put that on. Set a clipping distance. When you come down to the frame, this is where we were initially. You can reset these, make sure they're all good. There's our anti-aliasing. And then ray tracing's on by default. Generally, I just leave that unless I got some heavy-duty refraction going on. I don't really mess with these at all. And then global illumination we've been using on or off. We don't need it on this scene, but that is when the indirect illumination, like our environment, is used to actually help light the scene. And if we're doing more of the indirect illumination, we can have a radiance cache on. And I'm going to use this more for architectural, where it caches that data, stores it, and helps you render a little bit faster depending on how you have things set up. And caustics. So I'll put caustics on. Caustics are like the little refraction lines that hit the side of a pool underwater. That light refracts and creates caustics. Or just put a metal ring on a table, and when the light hits it and bounces and bends and hits another surface, gives you that look of caustics. Walkthrough mode is great because what it'll do is it'll calculate and then allow you to use kind of a cached version. So as long as nothing's moving, like shadows and light, things that are needed to recalculate the caustics, if those aren't recalculating, you can put walkthrough mode on because you're just moving the camera through. And so those initial settings are kind of stored and help save on render time. Okay, so that's primarily it for setting up the render. Just camera view, camera effects, set up the frame information, and then when you're ready, go up here to render. You've got a number of different options, but of course we talked about render passes. You're just going to go render animation. And in this panel, you've got first frame, last frame, gives you another option to set it, which is good, and of course you want one. Render pass group, you could render out one of those groups right there that I showed you in the last video. So you have to show your client one way, render it out. Show your client another way, render it out. Now, you could render out as layered images if you're going to bring it to Photoshop or perhaps After Effects. I don't recommend rendering to a movie, whether you're Mac or PC. There's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, you don't really have much control over crashing. So let's say you render this out. It's a 7-hour render, and at the 6th hour, your power goes out, or you forgot to plug in your laptop, or the software itself crashes, or what I've had mostly is that the QuickTime Saver crashes. And guess what? Those hours of rendering are wasted. The other option, what can happen, let's say in AVI, happened to me a couple of times, you didn't set the right compression. You set a really crummy compression and the wrong frame rate. And suddenly you just spent all the time rendering to a movie file that you can't use. So I highly recommend rendering to an image sequence. Click OK. And when your panel comes up, choose what type of frame you want to render. And I usually do a nice high-res 16-bit TIFF for two reasons. We can pull that frame up anytime we want and use it for a client render. Use it for the cover of a DVD, whatever we need. But then when we import those into our editor, import those into QuickTime Pro or AVI or DivX or whatever we're using, import that sequence, export it out to, again, whatever we need. So a full frame uncompressed sequence, like a raw file almost. That's how I render. Import it and then export it out to a Windows Media, to QuickTime. QuickTime in animation codec, QuickTime in H.264 codec, and so on. It's a great way to render. Well, I think that's going to about do it for this course. We planned on 6 hours. We did over 8 on it. There's still a lot more areas I really wanted to cover, and maybe at some point down the road we'll add to it with recoil. We'll add some new recoil training, but recommend going to lynda.com. There's Moto training up there, and there's going to be some more in the future. And then if you want to contact me, our main site is agadigital.com. Our photography site is ablingallery.com. And I will see you next time around.